It took exactly 94 seconds from the moment Senator Van Hollen's sharp, decisive voice first uttered the specific figure, $8,743,112. 55, for the carefully constructed bureaucratic facade to shatter, revealing the exposed nerve of a secret operation now fatally compromised on national television. It took exactly 94 seconds from the moment Senator Van Hollen's sharp, decisive voice first uttered the specific figure, $8,743,112. 55, for the carefully constructed bureaucratic facade to shatter, revealing the exposed nerve of a secret operation now fatally compromised on national television. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence hearing room, known formally as Hart 216, was an architectural expression of institutional power, cool, clinical, and unforgiving. Marble walls absorbed sound, amplifying only the sudden crack of a gavel or the precise, measured words spoken into the fixed, static humming microphones. The air was dry and smelled faintly of old paper and new coffee. Fluorescent lighting, filtered through thick, frosted panels above, cast a soft, inescapable glow that failed to hide the fatigue lines etched around the eyes of the two men seated at the witness table. Deputy Director Ethan Bondi sat ramrod straight, a 40-year veteran of the Bureau whose face was a carefully curated blank slate of controlled professionalism. To his left, FBI Director Marcus Thorne, older, grayer, slightly slumped, possessed the grim, haunted stillness of a man who knew he was being forced to witness an execution of character he could not prevent. At the horseshoe-shaped dais, Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat Maryland, chairman of the Subcommittee on Administrative Oversight, leaned forward. His voice, generally soft, acquired a penetrating, almost metallic quality when addressing witnesses under oath. He held a thin, unbound file, the papers rustling subtly as he adjusted his grip. Bondi watched the file, his eyes tracking the movement like a cat watching a snake. He knew the papers contained the proof of an administrative failure. The size of the failure was the only variable. Mr. Bondi, Van Hollen began, his tone lacking any discernible malice, which only heightened the tension. You certified the operational budget for the Covert Domestic Surveillance Unit, codenamed Aegis, for fiscal year 2024. Is that correct? Bondi inhaled slowly, hands clasped tightly beneath the mahogany table. Yes, Senator. I signed the final certification report on October 1, 2023, based on projections forwarded by the Chief Finance Officer for National Security Programs. And those projections, Van Hollen continued, turning a page, showed an allocated, congressionally approved expenditure ceiling of $1.5 million for hardware procurement, primarily advanced optical sensors and server maintenance. Do you dispute that number? No, Senator. That was the line item designated for equipment acquisition, as per the Intelligence Authorization Act of 2024, Section 312(b). Bondi's use of the specific legislative citation was intended to project competence and command. Van Hollen paused, letting the reference hang in the air, then delivered the first blow, his gaze unwavering. Then perhaps you can explain Exhibit A, Mr. Bondi. Van Hollen slid a single sheet of paper down the table to a waiting aide, who placed it on the monitor displayed directly in front of Bondi. It was a receipt, a detailed, itemized ledger on Department of Defense letterhead. This is a consolidated invoice, dated March 14th of this year, for the immediate, unscheduled acquisition of specialized, off-the-shelf satellite link jamming technology, purchased from a defense contractor in Northern Virginia. Van Hollen fixed him with a stare that demanded an answer. The total cost for this single, unscheduled purchase, paid for by the Aegis Unit's operational slush fund, not the approved procurement line, was $8,743,112. 55. Not $1. 5 million. Not $2 million. We are discussing an $8.7 million expenditure. Can you tell this committee, under oath, why this amount, an amount 7.5 times the allocated congressional limit, was spent without a formal budget amendment or supplemental appropriation request, potentially in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act? The figure echoed in the room. Director Thorne shifted visibly, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Bondi swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw twitching. The meticulously clean slate of his face had cracked. He reached for the glass of water, his fingers grazing the cool surface but not lifting it. The clock had started. But the number was not the whole story. It was merely the ledger entry for the deeper crime. The air in Heart 216 had thickened from mere tension to palpable pressure, the silence punctuated only by the low whir of the committee's recording equipment. Senator Van Hollen made no immediate demand for an explanation. Instead, he employed the surgical precision of a prosecutor building an airtight chain of custody, shifting the focus from the act of spending to the administrative failure to report. Mr. Bondi, let us be clear about administrative process, Van Hollen resumed, his voice maintaining its steady, journalistic monotone. The $8.7 million in question was drawn from the Bureau's Contingency Acquisition Fund, a designation meant for unforeseen, immediate threats requiring expenditure up to $500,000, and requiring a formal, written notification to the DOJ oversight within 72 hours. Is that an accurate summary of the operating rules for that particular fund, as stipulated under the Executive Order 13495 guidelines? Bondi dabbed his forehead with a pressed, white handkerchief, a small, involuntary motion that betrayed the internal heat. The summary is mostly accurate, Senator. However, the nature of the Aegis unit's mission often requires flexibility. We considered the threat level, the operational necessity. Van Hollen cut him off, not with anger, but with an almost patronizing politeness. I understand the concept of operational necessity, Mr. Bondi. But necessity does not negate the rule of law. My question is strictly procedural. Did the Aegis unit, or anyone under your direct command, file the mandatory, written notification to the Department of Justice Oversight Committee within the prescribed 72-hour window following the March 14th expenditure? Bondi hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly to the stoic figure of Director Thorne, who did not move. It was a micro-expression of a plea for help that was instantly denied. We intended to, Senator. The notification was drafted, but due to concurrent operational tempo regarding the deployment of the newly acquired hardware, the final signing was unfortunately delayed. It was filed approximately 14 days later. A soft, collective rustle moved through the gallery, a blend of reporters, legal aides, and congressional staff realizing the administrative flaw was a significant, confessed misstep. 14 days, Van Hollen repeated, allowing the number to sit heavily. 14 days for an $8.7 million expenditure that, by your own guidelines, required a 72-hour notification. That is an administrative failure, Mr. Bondi. But let us move beyond mere delays. Did you, in your capacity as certifying officer, authorize the disbursement before ensuring the required legal documentation for extraordinary expenditure was finalized? Bondi's facade began to crumble at the edges. His right hand, now resting on the table, displayed a noticeable tremor. I relied on the representation of the Chief Finance Officer, sir. He assured me the documents were merely in transit to the oversight desk. But the chain of accountability stops with you, Van Hollen pressed, his voice rising slightly in volume but not in heat. As the signatory, the legal liability for adherence to the Anti-Deficiency Act, 31 U.S.C. Section 1341, which strictly forbids authorizing or incurring expenditures in excess of or ahead of appropriations, rests entirely on your shoulders. Isn't that correct? Bondi nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Yes, Senator. I accept administrative responsibility for the delay. Administrative responsibility for a delay, Van Hollen murmured, the tone now subtly mocking. He slid the next exhibit, a thick, stapled document, into view. Let us look at Exhibit B. This is an excerpt from the Bureau's own internal program integrity audit conducted last month. On page 47, it states, the acquisition of specialized satellite link technology was authorized on a verbal basis by D.D. Bondi 10 days before any expenditure authority was retroactively sought, constituting an explicit violation of the Bureau's own financial protocols, Section 21(c) of the Federal Administrative Guidelines. Your own audit, Mr. Bondi, uses the word explicit violation. Do you maintain that this was merely a delay? Bondi stared at the damning text on the screen, his mouth slightly ajar. He leaned back into his chair, the sudden movement causing the heavy oak chair to creak sharply, momentarily breaking the silence. Director Thorne shifted in his seat, placing his hand on Bondi's arm, a gesture that looked more like an attempt to physically restrain than offer comfort. The initial calm was gone. The numbers had done their work. The financial oversight was the wound. The next chapter would probe the poison. The focus of Senator Van Hollen's inquiry now shifted from the procedural sin of financial mismanagement to the constitutional offense inherent in the expenditure's purpose. The room felt colder, the legal stakes rising exponentially as the senator moved from administrative ledgers to fundamental rights. Mr. Bondi, let us talk about what that $8.7 million purchased, Van Hollen instructed, his gaze sharpening. The invoice explicitly details a real-time dynamic jamming and link-forging array, designed to intercept and manipulate unencrypted, non-commercial satellite data links within the continental United States. Correct? Bondi's defensive posture hardened. It is advanced communication technology, Senator. I cannot elaborate on its specific capabilities in this open setting due to classification issues, as per National Security Directive 82. We are not asking for classified operational details, sir, Van Hollen retorted, his patience thinning. We are asking about probable cause. Let me be precise. The Aegis unit, under your direction, used this unappropriated technology to conduct domestic surveillance operations on over 200 American citizens between March and June of this year. We know this from the metadata recovered in the internal audit. My question is legal, not technical. For how many of those 200-plus targets did the Bureau obtain a valid, particularized warrant supported by probable cause from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, under FISA Section 702, or, for domestic cases, a traditional court order under Rule 41 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure? Bondi stammered, the smooth recitation of legal citations from the previous chapter completely gone. He reached for his water glass again, this time lifting it and taking a long, shaky sip. Director Thorne watched him with an expression of weary resignation. Senator, the Aegis unit operates under a mandate of preemptive threat assessment, Bondi finally managed. The initial acquisition of data was conducted under a general administrative subpoena protocol, focusing on foreign threat vectors that transit through domestic networks. We were not targeting specific individuals initially. We were seeking patterns. The acquisition, therefore, fell under the Foreign Intelligence Exemption criteria, as interpreted by the Department's Office of Legal Counsel. Van Hollen placed both hands flat on the table, leaning in until his microphone nearly touched his chin. Interpretation is not law, Mr. Bondi. And a general administrative subpoena is a document used to obtain billing records from a telecom company, not a blanket authorization to conduct real-time, invasive domestic surveillance. You are referring to the Fourth Amendment, sir, which demands that no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause. Do you have a single, specific warrant for any of those 200-plus Americans? Bondi hesitated for a ruinous 7 seconds, his eyes darting frantically. The full due process review for those targets was ongoing, Senator. The immediacy of the operational intelligence precluded obtaining all warrants concurrently with the initial data collection. In other words, you conducted wide-scale domestic surveillance on American citizens using unappropriated funds, without the legally required probable cause warrants, Van Hollen concluded, his voice now a low, chilling hammer blow. This is not a matter of a delayed memo, Mr. Bondi. This is a potential violation of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment and a direct, categorical breach of the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures. Van Hollen then dropped the definitive piece of paper, Exhibit C, a redacted memo from the DOJ's Civil Liberties Unit sent to Bondi's office 3 months prior. Exhibit C, dated January 5th. This document explicitly warned your office that the proposed Aegis methodology, if implemented without individual warrants, would render any collected evidence fruit of the poisonous tree, and expose the agents involved to severe civil and criminal liability for constitutional violation. Mr. Bondi, you signed the acknowledgement page for this warning. Did you subsequently disregard the legal counsel of the Department of Justice itself? Bondi looked at the memo, his control finally slipping. The $8 $7 million was just the cost of the illegal equipment. The real cost was the constitutional betrayal. His mouth opened to speak, but no sound emerged. The floor was set for the collapse. He had failed the financial test. He was about to fail the legal one. The silence that followed the revelation of the January 5 DOJ warning was absolute, a vacuum into which the integrity of Deputy Director Ethan Bondi was being slowly pulled. The clock was ticking from the moment he failed to provide a single, valid warrant. Senator Van Hollen stood up, towering over the witness table, his voice losing its even keel and gaining the edge of controlled moral outrage. Mr. Bondi, let me make this extremely simple. $7 million was spent on illegal surveillance technology. That technology was used to conduct warrantless surveillance on hundreds of Americans. The Department of Justice explicitly warned you this was a constitutional violation, a violation of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizure, and therefore a felony violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You disregarded that warning. Van Hollen stepped closer, his shadow falling across Bondi. My final question, sir, is this. When you authorized this massive, unbudgeted expenditure, were you aware that, by bypassing the congressional appropriations process, you were also bypassing the standard legal and classified review process that would have flagged the lack of warrants? Did you use the financial transgression, the Anti-Deficiency Act violation, as a means to commit the constitutional transgression? Director Thorne put his hand on Bondi's shoulder again, this time harder. He was silently pleading with his deputy to stay composed, to use the customary DC playbook, invoke classification, demand a closed session, deny intent. But the pressure was too great. Bondi's composure, built over 4 decades of bureaucratic defense, detonated. He tried to speak, but his voice broke, the sound a dry, ragged choke. His eyes, fixed on the damning Exhibit C, began to water. No, Senator. The intent was purely operational, Bondi whispered, his voice cracking painfully. He slammed his fist, trembling, onto the table, rattling the microphones. We were under time pressure. The threat was imminent. You sit up here and talk about $7 million, about Rule 41, about warrants. We were trying to protect the country. This is the price of keeping America safe. He buried his face in his hands, his body beginning to heave with uncontrollable, agonizing sobs. The meticulously tailored suit and the professional mask had dissolved. He was weeping openly, fully, a total psychological collapse broadcast live. The precise moment of breakdown, the 94th second after the initial warrant question, was captured by a flurry of camera flashes, their collective white light flooding the room like a judicial thunderclap. Director Thorne, his face pale and etched with panic, swiftly pushed his chair back, leaning over Bondi and whispering fiercely into his ear, attempting to halt the professional suicide on camera. Van Hollen watched the spectacle, his expression remaining grim, not triumphant. He understood that the breakdown wasn't merely emotional. It was legal confession. Bondi had explicitly defended a constitutional violation, the warrantless surveillance, by citing operational urgency, thereby admitting willful disregard for the due process clause. He had committed an explicit, televised breach of his oath to the Constitution, compounded by the admitted financial felony under the Anti-Deficiency Act. Van Hollen picked up his gavel and brought it down hard, the sound deafening. The witness has lost control of his testimony. This committee is in immediate recess. Director Thorne, you are ordered to provide a complete, unredacted report on the Aegis Unit's warrant procedures and constitutional compliance within 48 hours. Failing to do so will initiate contempt proceedings. The collapse was fatal because it demonstrated that the financial failure, misappropriation of funds, was directly linked to the legal failure, warrantless surveillance, in a desperate attempt to bypass accountability. The testimony proved not only administrative incompetence but a willful, documented violation of fundamental constitutional law. The cameras had stopped flashing, but the shockwave was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath was swift, brutal, and broadcast across every news ticker in the nation. The image of Deputy Director Bondi weeping, his forehead resting on the mahogany table as Director Thorne desperately tried to cover the microphones, became the instant visual shorthand for institutional failure. Within minutes of the recess, the cable news cycle exploded. On CNN, former Solicitor General Ilara Vance spoke with cold, legal certainty. Constitutional scholars called it the most devastating Senate takedown since Watergate. Bondi's emotional breakdown was less important than his legal testimony. He admitted to a willful violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act to fund a warrantless surveillance program. He didn't just break an administrative rule. He attacked the bedrock principle of the Fourth Amendment. This is not incompetence. This is criminal negligence with potential civil rights liability. On Fox News, legal commentator Michael Hayes focused on the chain of command. For 94 seconds, America watched competence collapse. The immediate consequence must be the resignation of Director Thorne. He oversaw an $8.7 million black market budget for a domestic spy operation. The FBI's credibility, its constitutional oath, is now in freefall. The political consequences materialized instantly. Senate Majority Leader Eleanor Vance, Democrat Pennsylvania, issued a 4-sentence statement demanding an immediate, special counsel investigation into the unauthorized financial and operational abuses of the Aegis unit. Meanwhile, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee initiated an emergency subpoena for all documents related to the $8.7 million procurement receipt and the underlying warrant applications, if any existed. Director Thorne, visibly shaken, emerged 3 hours later from a closed-door meeting with the committee's vice chair, issuing a terse, 60-second public statement. He announced that Deputy Director Bondi had been placed on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a joint Department of Justice and FBI Office of Professional Responsibility investigation, citing gross fiduciary mismanagement and potential constitutional noncompliance. The greatest damage, however, was not to Bondi's career, but to the Bureau's operational capability. Within 24 hours, the Attorney General issued a sweeping directive: all ongoing domestic surveillance programs that utilize technology purchased outside of the Annual Appropriations Act, specifically naming satellite link interception, must be immediately halted and all collected data sealed, pending a full judicial review. Legal experts estimated that because Bondi had admitted to using the unappropriated funds to bypass the warrant process, every piece of evidence collected by the Aegis unit against those 200-plus American citizens was now legally poisoned. The ensuing civil lawsuits, filed within the week, threatened to bankrupt the federal government in liability claims related to the deprivation of civil rights under the Bivens Doctrine. The $8.7 million expenditure had purchased a constitutional catastrophe. The official investigation had begun, but the institution itself was already bleeding credibility. The final chapter of the Bondi scandal played out not in the televised spectacle of the Senate hearing room, but in the quiet, merciless mechanics of institutional accountability. The $8.7 million invoice, once a mere financial footnote, had become the Rosetta Stone for understanding a much deeper rot within the Bureau's command structure. The $8.7 million was ultimately determined to have been siphoned from a legitimate, but highly flexible, counterterrorism fund, the Consolidated Priority Acquisition Account, under the pretext of acquiring highly specialized overseas communications equipment. This deceptive transfer was the foundational violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. It was the initial lie that allowed the constitutional lie to follow. By using these unappropriated funds, Bondi and the Aegis unit intentionally avoided the layers of legal review, including the FISA court prescreening, that are triggered when sensitive domestic surveillance tools are procured through standard channels. The consequences were exhaustive and asymmetric. Director Thorne, though facing immense political pressure, survived, primarily by agreeing to an immediate, permanent disbandment of the Aegis unit and establishing an unprecedented, 3-year oversight mandate from the Senate Judiciary Committee. He scapegoated Bondi, characterizing the former deputy director's actions as an isolated instance of a high-stress official overriding protocol under a misguided belief of operational necessity. Ethan Bondi, however, was destroyed. Within a week, the Department of Justice announced it was pursuing criminal charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1341, mail fraud, and 31 U.S.C. Section 1350, criminal penalty for violating Anti-Deficiency Act, though the much graver civil rights charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242 were dropped, deemed too complex to prosecute without jeopardizing sensitive information. Bondi resigned from the Bureau, his pension frozen pending the outcome of the financial felony charges. The true legal lesson, as articulated by the Supreme Court's eventual refusal to hear the appeal of the first set of civil rights claims against the government, was about the supremacy of due process over operational convenience. The court's one-line denial validated the constitutional failure. An operation funded by illegal means cannot produce legal results. The Fourth Amendment was not merely a guideline to be deferred in times of crisis. It was the non-negotiable prerequisite for lawful government action. The system, in its slow, grinding way, had corrected itself. The spectacle was over, the tears dried, and the cameras turned elsewhere. But the lesson remained etched into the administrative conscience of Washington. Accountability, it turned out, was not the punishment for failure, but the structure that prevented the catastrophic, warrantless erosion of fundamental rights. The lights of the Senate chamber were dimmed, leaving only the polished, unforgiving marble. Some careers end in scandal. His ended in silence. Washington doesn't punish ignorance. It replaces it. The precise expenditure for one mistake, $8,743,112.55, became the currency of a constitutional reckoning. The tragedy wasn't just the betrayal of the public trust, but the stark realization that the easiest checks to bypass, the financial ones, were often the most important safeguards for liberty.